Yeah, there's several different types of cybersecurity assessments out there. There's maturity assessments, there's gap assessments, vulnerability assessments, and risk assessments are kind of the major ones. And there's a lot of confusion in industry about what those different types of assessments are and the value of each of those different types and what you use them for.
The four assessments, typically you might start with a maturity assessment. And this is where you're going to evaluate an organization's policy, procedures, and standards and understand what they call as their target cybersecurity posture. This is where the organization wants to be.
So a lot of organizations are interested in understanding their compliance to either regulatory requirements, industry standards, internal standards, and that's usually best measured with a gap assessment. So it's oftentimes called a compliance gap assessment because that's what you're trying to measure the difference in the gap, the magnitude of those gaps, essentially. And that's an important thing to understand, is how compliant are we? But that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have risk. You could be 100% compliant, but still have residual risk that the standards don't address, or your particular application doesn't address, and vice versa. You could have no compliance or very minimal compliance, but still actually be managing risk because you possibly have other safeguards in place that reduce that risk, or the consequences aren't that great. So.
The next assessment you'll hear of is a vulnerability assessment. So this is where you look for weaknesses or flaws, hardware, software, firmware, configuration weaknesses that could be improved or could be exploited to lead to ultimately a consequence. And so the recommendations there are removing those, updating software or removing unnecessary software, updating hardware, firmware, things like that.
Whereas a risk assessment is a more holistic. It's actually looking at what is the operational risks associated with a cybersecurity compromise in terms of health, safety, environmental, financial kind of consequences.
So maturity is the target posture. Where do we want to be? Gap is the current posture. Where are we at? And the differences between where we want to be, where we're at. Vulnerability are those weaknesses in your system that could be exploited. And risk is the culmination of all of that to understand what is the consequence or what is the impact.